So today we're going to look at Gaunilo's criticism of the ontological argument. It's specifically his criticism of Anselm's ontological argument, and he was writing at the same time as Anselm. He was replying directly to Anselm. So remember that Anselm says, I have this idea of God, and this idea of God, he has a whole load of attributes. He's things like omnipotent, which means, of course, all powerful. He's omniscient, which means, of course, all knowing. He's omnibenevolent, which means, of course, all loving or all good, and so on. He is all of the omnis. He is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. He is perfect. But of course, there's this other thing, isn't there? There's existence, and existence is actually, isn't that a perfection too? And God is perfect, so God must have existence. If he is perfect, God must also exist. And Gaunilo says to this, hold on a second. I can imagine a whole load of things that are just in my mind. They say that somewhere in the world there is this there is this kind of island, and this perfect island exists somewhere. It's got nice sandy beaches and beautiful rocks from which to jump into the sea. It's got palm trees and all of the fruit you could ever eat, and a wonderful forest full of game that you can hunt and shelter for night, even maybe a waterfall. Well, of course, if this kind of perfect island exists in my mind, surely, according to Anselm's argument, it would exist also in the real world, because just like God, it must have every perfection. So Gaunilo's central idea, then, is that Anselm's argument can be used to prove anything. And if it can be used to prove anything, then it must be wrong in some way. Because that perfect island doesn't exist, unfortunately. So just to remind ourselves of what Anselm's argument is in a little bit more detail, he says, look, first of all, I have an idea of God. So this idea is of a being in which nothing greater can be conceived, a perfect being, but he exists only as an idea. And yet, surely it is greater to exist than not to exist. It's greater to exist than not to exist. And if he is the greatest possible being, then my conception of him is either wrong if it's only as a conception, or he actually does exist. And seeing as my conception isn't wrong, it's not self-contradictory, then of course God must exist. And that's my kind of simplified version of Anselm's argument. Now, Gaunilo writes on behalf of the fool. The fool is Anselm's term for the atheist. So when Gaunilo's writing, Gaunilo is a monk. He's not an atheist, but he's writing as if he were one, as if he were the fool. And his central point is that I can prove anything with this argument. He says, let me show you. He says, well, I have an idea of an island, of this kind of perfect island. And this perfect island must have, surely, every perfection. This, what he calls the lost island, with all of the riches of the world in it. He says, well, if I have this idea of a perfect island, and of course, existence is better than non-existence. And of course, the perfect island must have all perfections. Well then, I don't know how to spell island all of a sudden, despite it being written here. So the perfect island must have all perfections. And existence is a perfection. Well, then, of course, the island exists. The point is that this reasoning, he's not actually arguing that an island exists. In fact, the opposite. He's saying that this reasoning is the same as Anselm's and seems to attempt to prove the existence of some island, and you could do this with any such thing. So his conclusion, of course, then, is that the reasoning is wrong. In some fundamental way. As he writes, if I say, if I say someone wishes thus to persuade me that this island really exists beyond all doubt, I should think that he was joking, or I should find it hard to decide which of us I ought to judge the bigger fool. He's using some wordplay there at the end with the concept of the fool. Now, there are various replies. Alvin Plantinga, for instance, replies by saying that this concept doesn't make any sense. You can't really have a perfect island. You could also always add another palm tree or another waterfall. Another response comes from Anselm himself, and Anselm says in reply, look, his argument only the argument only applies to God. Why is that? Well, he has a reason. Remember that Anselm dedicates 2 chapters to his ontological argument, and Gaunilo's really attacking the argument in chapter 2, the idea that existence and reality, as well as the mind, is better than just existence in the mind. But Anselm has a second chapter in which he says that necessary existence is greater than non-necessary or contingent existence. And necessary existence is something that only God has. By its very nature, i.e. by it being an island can't have necessary existence. Necessary existence, remember, is when something cannot not exist. It has to exist. Whereas an island, well, that only exists contingently. Why is that? Well, let's just define it first. So contingent existence is when it could not exist. Or another way of saying that is it is dependent upon other things for its existence. And an island must be, right? It must be surrounded by water. You must be able to dig it. You must be able to construct your island hut or island swim-up bar, or it is a perfect island after all, or whatever you want. Whereas God isn't like that. So of course, says Anselm, necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. And seeing as the island can't have necessary existence, well, then it isn't a perfect island, because the concept doesn't make any sense. Whereas the concept of a perfect God does, and it's the only one that makes any sense.